going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, I just wanted to jump on here real quick and discuss some significant Steelers news that dropped yesterday. A Steelers Now exclusive story from Alan Saunders and Nick Faribault. Our news outlet broke that the Steelers and Cam Heyward have begun contract negotiations on a potential extension. Pretty big news. Obviously, Cam's one of the most decorated Steelers defenders of all time. Entering the last year of his contract, 2024, he carries as of right now, a $22 million cap hit. One of the highest paid players on the team currently. Last year dealing with the injury over the offseason, there was some speculation about is he going to continue to play? How much longer does he want to play? Just want to kind of go over some of the key talking points really on the story, and I'll link the original article back to SteelersNow.com that you guys can go read on your own time as well. But the big thing was, they said that they've already talked about an extension. He said, we'll see what happens. My goal is to play 2 to 3 more years, mostly 3. I'm looking for an opportunity. We'll see what happens. I'd like for it to be here, but my goal is to play. So it sounds like Cam really has his mindset on continuing his career well beyond this season. So definitely interesting to hear him say that. I wasn't really sure how much longer Cam really wanted to do this, but it definitely seems like he's got his mindset on prolonging this thing as long as he can play. And, good for him. I definitely think that that's a good thing for the Steelers defense. I think that, you really can make a pretty easy argument that the Steelers are much, much better with him on the field than off it. He's been an extremely productive player. As of right now, I think he's tied with James Harrison for second all time in Steelers history in sacks since it became an official stat back in 1982. So this is one of the guys that's been really a linchpin of the Steelers defense. So I kind of wanted to look at some numbers and then just talk about what an extension looks like, the pros and cons to kind of both sides of that. But just before we get started, if y'all do me a favor, just like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. I kind of threw together just a really quick graphic for you guys. Let me see if I can throw it up. All right, there we go. Just to kind of look at some numbers of Cam over the years, just kind of the 4 really basic but big, numbers for an interior defensive lineman. Look at pressure rate, sack percentage, pass rush win rate, and run stop percentage. Those first 2 categories, those are just from Sports Info Solutions. The last 2 are from Pro Football Focus. Pretty standard stuff there. I don't really think I'm going to go into too much depth, but you can see the pressure numbers, sack percentage numbers. Those have decreased over the last couple seasons. The big caveat is, last year in 2023, he only played really 1 game at full health before he ended up suffering that core muscle injury, that sports hernia that he was dealing with. Typically a 3-month rehab time. He ended up making it back, I think, in a little bit over 2. So, I think we can probably acknowledge that Cam wasn't 100% even after he got back into the lineup last year, right? So that's obviously very important context when you're looking at some of these 2023 numbers, which declined quite a bit from the year prior. But I also think that it's probably worth noting that, as Cam Heyward's going into his age 35 season, it's probably unrealistic to expect him to kind of revert back to that 2021 form as well, right? So you look at the pass rush numbers, really fairly steady on win rate, dropping down to 9.7. That's not a terrible number for a guy that plays full time. I think it was still second on the Steelers in terms of defensive linemen, just right behind Keanu Benton. But I really want to talk a little bit about just the run stop stuff. I think Cam, as much as I did see, you could definitely tell he was lacking burst off the ball last year, late in the season. Like I said, he wasn't playing close to 100%, but I still felt like this dude is still strong as ever. He's still strong as an ox, and I think that there is so much value in having an interior defender that can not only provide some value as a passer or a pass rusher, but also a guy who is really dependable on the interior in terms of taking on double teams, deconstructing blocks, making sure he's maintaining gap integrity, making plays in the backfield, all that stuff is just still, that's still super, super valuable, right? And I feel like there are still parts of his game that he's still playing at a really high level. You look at that run stop percentage, man, 11.7. That's a really, really good number for an interior defender. Even taking it into account that, the pass rush production really wasn't there last season while he was, kind of playing through that injury. But, just the 2022 numbers, man, he started off 22 really slow, but over the second half of the year, his numbers completely spiked. You talk about the Steelers made that really big playoff push 2 years ago as well. He was a huge part of that, man. Over the past, the last 8 games or so, he was on an absolute tear. And I think that is really encouraging when you're looking at, a guy at this stage of his career. He was still top 10 in pressures and total run stops as an interior defensive lineman. That was his age 33 season. So, I mean, there's still plenty of value in a player like that. He's only going to be 2 years removed from being, one of the best players at his position. I think that that's definitely worth talking about in terms of, we can talk a little bit about just like the contract stuff as it is. And, a lot of people were asking me yesterday on Twitter about like, what does this do for his cap hit? What kind of cap space are we talking about? All this different stuff. So according to Over the Cap, $22.4 million cap hit. That's significant, right? Even though Cam's no longer in the top 10 of his position, because the interior defensive lineman market's kind of blown up a little bit. But he still has a significant cap hit. Really, this is a result of them restructuring his contract and freeing up cap space in years prior, kind of kicking the can and pushing some of that hit down the line. And once you get to the last year deals, typically this is what happens. The cap hit really inflates, and you usually make a decision on like, do you want to keep the player? Do you want to extend the player? Or you just want to ride it out? I think it's an interesting discussion in Cam's case, right? Because could the Steelers use more cap space? I mean, they're sitting at about $18 million in cap space. I mean, you can always use more cap space, and any cap space that you don't use this year, you can always roll it over to next year, right? Having said that, though, they just restructured Alex Highsmith's contract. They've still got full restructures on the table for TJ Watt and Mika Fitzpatrick. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. Those two restructures in itself is like a little over like $17 million of available space to them if they want it. The Steelers are also 28th in cash spending this offseason. They haven't spent a bunch of money. I mean, part of that is, they found two really cheap quarterback options. Getting the Russell Wilson contract with how unique that is in its structure, the Denver Broncos paying the majority of his salary for this season, and getting him on basically the vet minimum has a lot to do with that. But the Steelers haven't been extremely aggressive in terms of, spending a bunch of money on this roster and really, what I would call like just straight up pushing the chips in. Now, could they still do that? Potentially. But like you look at the free agent market, right? Like it's, what is it? It's mid-May. So, I mean, there's not going to be a ton of significant, quote unquote, needle movers at either on the offensive or defensive side of the ball that you're just going to be able to acquire on the open market, right? Now, the restructure of Highsmith, Omar Khan talked about it was to give them flexibility. So, if they wanted to try to trade for a wide receiver, you want to be able to have that cap space available because, some of these receivers that, they've been linked to or at least called about also need new contracts. The Steelers don't have a bunch of players signed for beyond this season. I think it's about close to 30 players signed for 2025. They don't have a ton of money committed to anybody. They don't have a quarterback on the roster. We talked at length about that on this channel. So what does that really mean? It's just, to me, I don't know that the cap space created by an extension for Heyward is really all that extremely beneficial unless you're talking about going and signing or going and making a significant trade to kind of put the offense over the top, maybe at the receiver position to where you're going to have to hand out a ton of money, or something like that. But again, there's cap space available on the roster. All they got to do is restructure Watt, restructure Minka. You don't really have to do that. Now, the other question is like, what would a contract extension for Heyward even look like? That's where I think it gets really interesting because it's kind of tough, right? Like there's not a ton of guys playing this position at 35 years old. There's just not really a lot of good comparisons that you can offer them in terms of, contracts to compare it against or anything like that. I mean, Aaron Donald just retired. He's 33 years old, but I think, Donald was kind of in his own tier at the position for so long. That kind of feels pretty unrealistic. You look at some of the other guys that got paid this offseason. I mean, Christian Wilkins, Justin Madubuike, Chris Jones, Derek Brown, like those guys are in their prime of their careers. Those guys are in their late 20s. That's not really, Heyward's age range. The one comparison that I kind of found that kind of might make some semblance of sense would be a guy like Fletcher Cox for the Eagles. Cox he has some similarities in terms of like what he's meant to the organization. He's been a leader in the locker room for a long time over there, a really steady veteran who's played a lot of really good football, man, and really been a core piece of their defense. Great in the community. A lot of similarities between him and Heyward. Fletcher ended up signing a 1-year, $10 million deal. They actually let him hit free agency this past a couple months ago, and then he came back. 1 year, $10 million deal. I think about $8.5 million of that is guaranteed. So could an extension like that make sense where the Steelers, gave Cam a 1 or 2 year extension for around like 10 million per year and still, we're able to save some cap space, create some this year, and then keep the cap hits, relatively minimal over the next 2 years. The guaranteed money would probably be a big talking point, right? Like Cam's entering the final stages of his career, age and all that stuff in terms of like when players just fall off a cliff is relatively unpredictable. But once you get, into your 30s, that stuff becomes a lot more likely, right? So you don't want to, from an organizational standpoint, you don't want to make sure that you're handing out lots of guarantees on players that may just not be able to play at that same high level that we've come to expect from a guy like Cam. But also like it takes two to negotiate, right? Like who we don't really know what type of money that Hayward would be seeking. Would he be interested in taking a 1 year, a 2 year deal for around 10 million or something like that? Similar cops, I think Fletcher's a year younger than Cam is, but I think you could make an argument that those are pretty similar players. If not, Cam might even have the advantage over the last year or two prior to that injury. But is he going to want to come back and play for something like that? I mean, not that 10 million is anything to laugh about, but it is a step down from his prior contract where he signed, I think it was about 16 or 17 million dollars per season. So I mean, it's something to keep in mind, right? Like his last contract, I'm just looking at it right now, 16.4 million per season. Now, just my opinion, this is just me talking, but I would not be interested in terms of like giving a 2 year extension in a similar kind of money value beyond this year. If we're talking, giving him like a 2 year, like $35 million extension or something like that, where you're paying a little bit more. Granted, the cap number has went up over the years since he last signed that contract. But I think for me, like 2 years, like 35, 40 million would be a little bit risky in my opinion, just because of what we saw last year, just in terms of like some of his pass rush stuff. How much of that was the injury? How much of that is just age creeping in? Like, I don't know. I want to be optimistic and say the majority of that was probably injury history related, but I think you have to acknowledge that, there is a chance that, he's not going to be able to return back to even that 2022 form. And when you're talking about paying a guy, 17, $18 million per season, you need an impact player at that point. And even if Cam is still the very reliable, very strong run defender, it's difficult to pay, that type of money to an interior defensive lineman if they're not a very impactful pass rusher, which was really the case last year. So I think it's an interesting dynamic. It's definitely something to watch for. 2 to 3 years is definitely it's more than I anticipated. Cam coming out and saying that in May, entering 2024, I kind of expected him to maybe take it year by year. It's interesting that they've already had some negotiations on a potential contract. Definitely be a talking point considering the Steelers like to they don't negotiate during the season, so all this stuff is going to play into training camp. We'll see what happens with that, how far these talks get, if they're able to come to an agreement, or if they kind of let this thing play out. But letting him play out the final year of his deal isn't the worst thing in the world, and it's probably my preferred um, option, just because, like I said, the Steelers have other avenues to create the cap space, and I just think that when you look at it, there's not a ton to gain really from the Steelers' perspective in terms of extending them. Because even if Cam comes back, let's just say he blows up this year and goes crazy. I don't think that I think Cam wants to be in Pittsburgh. I think Pittsburgh wants to have him, especially if he comes back and has that really really strong bounce back season this year. I think they'll be able to work something out. And I think that then if you want to commit to, okay, we still think this dude's playing at an extremely high level, we're going to give him a sizable contract or something like that for another year or two, then I think it makes more sense because you've seen him do it more recently than, at this stage right now, coming off that injury riddled season. But it's definitely something that's going to be fun to, see progress over the course of the offseason. You guys let me know, like, what y'all think. What are y'all thinking in terms of, y'all want to see an extension for Cam? Like I said, one of the best players really throughout my lifetime, watching the Steelers over the years. And, I definitely would like to see him finish his career in Pittsburgh. It would be really weird if he was in another jersey. But I'm just not sure, depending on like what the money looks like, I'm just not sure it makes sense at this stage. We'll just have to see how that kind of plays out. But again, appreciate y'all watching. Enjoy y'all's Mother's Day. Make sure y'all have a good rest of your weekend. And just make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications on your way out. And I will check you guys next time.